All right, we're here at Dr. D's Social Network with two awesome people, Erin and Chris. Thank you both for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It looks like today we're going to talk a little bit about misinformation and believe in our business, but in general, and how do we combat that? But before we get into that, Erin, we talked a little bit about this off air. How did you and Chris combine forces to begin discussing this?
Yeah, great question. So, Chris, you had seen a webinar that I had done, correct, for the American Council on Exercise and connected with me on LinkedIn. And we went back and forth with the messaging and then thought, let's just set up a Zoom conversation. And what was, I think, originally scheduled for, 40 minutes turned into 90 because we had so much to talk about surrounding like our respective fields and the lenses through which we view our profession and our field. So we had this conversation about like what are the challenges that we have in our profession and how is it that other allied health professionals can link arms and help consumers be better advocates for themselves when it comes to consuming health information. Like, how do we help them be health literate and educate them in a way that resonates with them? And I had brought you up, Darian, and had said, we've got this great friend. He's amazing at social media podcasts. And so we decided, hey, what if we got together and had a conversation about misinformation in the health and fitness and mental health space, psychological space? There's misinformation. Like if it's a science, there's misinformation somewhere. Chris, does that about capture it?
Pretty much covers it. Yeah. Yeah. I saw the presentation that Erin gave on the American Council on Exercise website. I watched it and I was just blown away to the point where I was texting friends, we need this in our field so badly. So, and I guess I tagged you and that kind of started a conversation going. And I'm really grateful that we're here today to be able to talk about this.
Yes, me as well.
Fantastic. So, I want to jump this off a little bit with what are some of the current challenges that we're facing and with our technology, with misinformation? And the second part, what are some practical solutions that we can start on a large scale first before diving into more of a micro aspect of it?
Great question. A couple things come to mind when I think about that question. I think some of the challenges, particularly in this digitally driven world that we're in, content is so easy to create and it's so easy to veil the truth. If you just even look at, I'm just going to go with the fitness influencer, not that there's not qualified influence, people that have elevated themselves to that position of influencer. There's a lot of what I call slippery scientists that they take these sort of creative liberties with the truth or data and research and they cherry pick and then they create a narrative around that. And I think in this world, that's so accessible now. You can get Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, all of those things for free. LinkedIn, you don't as much see the misinformation for sure. But in everyday interactions and people consuming that content, they're seeing all of these variations of the truth. And sometimes it's about who speaks the loudest, has the most followers, maybe has the best marketing team, who's paid for the most followers. What are the big names behind them that tends to get the attention as far as, oh, obviously this person knows what they're doing. Not the case. They get things wrong all the time. And I think that's a challenge on both the consumer side and the professional side. Then it puts like the three of us, for example, in this position of trying to unravel the truth and pick out those nuggets of things that are accurate but that are being veiled in a way that create this different message that, again, takes that creative liberty with what is the actual data. And we've got individuals out there who are not data-driven scientists, don't understand the research process, and just Google something and pick out like, oh, so they read this on this and didn't actually go to the actual study to contextualize it and figure out what's going on. And I think that's one of the big challenges. And then I think as health and exercise professionals, as psychologists, as mental health professionals, insert whatever your respective field is, there's always going to be that credibility piece. Like, how do we elevate our credibility? Like, the acronyms behind our name don't necessarily mean anything to consumers. And that becomes like another educational piece of teaching them like how you sift through that mess, that noise in a lot of ways, and figure out who's qualified, and then ask the question, why are they qualified? Why is this person the authority on X, Y, or Z, whatever the topic is? And I think those are two really big challenges right now. And Chris, I'll let you address some challenges, and then maybe we can circle back to practical strategies.
Sure. Yeah, I think, Erin, you covered a lot of the ones that I'm seeing, at least in my field as well. I think the idea of the logical fallacies, and a lot of people don't have training in those logical fallacy things like confirmation bias, and the fact that we have algorithms in social media that if you click on one thing, you're going to get a whole bunch of stuff that's going to confirm your viewpoint. Sometimes I click on things or I see ads, and how did the algorithm decide that I wanted it? We also have issues with not only just slippery science, but also now with things like predatory journals and pay-to-play journals where people are publishing things and they look credible. And to the general public, they look peer-reviewed, they look slick. And in the end, I think we talked about the one where the person submitted an article written and said that it was written by his cat, and it got accepted into a journal. So if I'm not someone who's trained in all these science-based practices, then maybe I'm not necessarily interested in all that science. How do I know what's good information? How do I know what stuff I should avoid? And as a field too, how do we combat some of this misinformation? Because I think one of the things that we're seeing in our field is that the way that we're doing it probably isn't the best way. And so just that in general, those practical strategies, I think us talking about that will be helpful to a lot of different fields.
Before we jump into these practical strategies, it's good to operationalize what is currently happening that is not working, so we have a baseline understanding here.
Yeah. I think currently and I can't quite wrap my head around like where the disconnect begins with people consuming this misinformation. And I feel like there's this very rudimentary level of teaching that we're missing in maybe it's the educational process. I'm not entirely sure, but I know as a college educator, I see misinformation being consumed and then presented as, this is what I found on creatine. We'll just insert that because it's well studied. And it's pretty incredible how the sourced information is technically not credible. There's no authority. There's huge biases that are very evident when you look at it from that evidence-based perspective. And not maybe, two things that I tell students when they're going to consume science or any information is to approach with both curiosity and skepticism. Be curious about what is it that is coming out of this research? What are the implications? And what does that then mean for you as a consumer, you as the budding professional? And then what does it mean for the landscape of the future of that research on said topic? But then also approach it with skepticism, and I think to a degree criticism, right? That's what the peer-reviewed process is all about, is these individuals, these qualified, educated, practiced individuals coming together and technically scrutinizing the research that has been put forth and asking questions. That's what we do in science, is we ask questions, and then we have this method that takes us through discovery, and then we ask more questions. The questions are never fully answered. Like, science is not out to prove. We are out to identify correlations and relationships and draw meaning and synthesis from all of the different pieces of information that quality research presents. So I feel like, at what point are we actually taught to thoughtfully, critically, and curiously consume scientific information in a way that allows us to, one, guide ourselves through an informed direction and make these conscious choices. At what point are we taught that? Because I'm not seeing it consistently as a higher education professional. And I've been in higher ed for 21 years. So I asked that question in my head, at what point is this part of what we learn? And should it be? So I think that's something that's not working right now. And also maybe on the professional side of things, not calling it out when we see it. I think that's there's a vulnerability piece that I think we have to really sink into and be like, this is wrong because, and here is other evidence that challenges this perspective in a way that is evidence-based versus in a way that's editorialized, if that makes sense. I think those are two.
About what's currently happening that you think is not being done well academically and professionally.
I can take this one if it's okay.
Yeah, go for it.
I think that in some ways, higher ed doesn't necessarily have the time to teach scientific literacy the way that it really needs to be done right now. I think students are coming to us with a very different skill set than what they used to have. And I don't mean, oh, these kids don't have this or whatever. They're coming in from a very different place than we did. I've been in higher ed for about 28 years, and there was no social media. You read a magazine maybe when you were bored. You couldn't get information 24/7, 365. Heck, I'm old enough to remember card catalog. It's very different. I type something in with 2 thumbs. I get a list of information. Where's that information coming from? Who said it? Just because someone says they have the letters behind their name doesn't necessarily mean they do. I ran a Facebook page for many years and an email listserv, and there were a lot of people who would say, oh, this person should know better because they have X credential. And I go back panel and I realize they don't have that credential at all. It's not that they're misrepresenting themselves. It was just assumed that they would have this credential because they were in this group, and they would have this knowledge because they were in this group. So it's easier for people to get knowledge. I think and the ways that we taught scientific literacy in the past maybe aren't necessarily as relevant now in some ways. I also think that the way we teach science has to evolve in some ways too, because doing an experiment, that always felt, oh, an expert does an experiment. Now that stuff is, again, readily available to everybody. And so really it is about what is credible evidence and what about these things that are masked that look like credible evidence? And how do you also assimilate people's lived experience into the evidence? Too, somebody tells you a story about their experience, you should believe them, yes. But does that necessarily mean that their experience kind of jives with all the science that's come together? Maybe not. So you have that. And then you have our consumers are coming to us. They're vulnerable. They're coming to us because they have an issue that they need addressed, whether it's I need to increase my quad strength, or in my case, increasing communication skills, or my child is engaging in self-injury, which is something that I work with. They're in a vulnerable space. And so having been in those spaces myself, sometimes just tell me what to do. And who is it that's telling you what to do, and what are their credentials to tell you that?
Most definitely. I'll add to this, I think, great points. I think one of the things in working out in academia, but mostly working and on the ground level of training people and stuff like that, and with colleagues, is that we've done a really poor job of creating community, like amongst ourselves and fitness influencers, whatever you want to call it. We've demonized these folks quite a bit. And some of it, obviously, we need to call out accountability of people just doing really bad stuff. But on the other hand, we have also made a very large blanket over all influencers. Oh, this is bad. These are bad. So we've created this polarization ourselves. And some of it, and I just like to be honest, I think some of it, some of us, especially with a lot of education and people who have been in the business a long time, they feel threatened by influencers. Their success threatens people who have a lot of education and who have been in the business and don't have the notoriety or the acclaim. And then someone else gets it. It's natural jealousy that people have. We got to get rid of that aspect. We have to kill that part and call out the stuff that's truly bad. But we've also created this monster by not being kind, caring, creating humility, and creating community with people who are doing some things way better than what we've done and
Yeah.
acknowledge.
I love that point because I think it's very courageous to say that. We're saying that the industry are partly to blame. And then there's this innate sort of like survivalist instinct of, oh gosh, what does this then make me irrelevant? I think is probably a question that some experience. And instead of looking at it as a threat, we need to also, and I say we, not as us in this room, but we in a sweeping generalization, shift that mindset to be like, how do we partner? Like, how do I elevate you? And how do you do the same? Like, where's the reciprocity and the synchronicity in what we do? And ultimately, when you look across the professions that deal with the vulnerable aspects of somebody's life, their health, their well-being, their mental health, medicine, we all have the same goal, or we hope that we have a very common goal of wanting to help people achieve their best life, however that looks for them and in whatever ways it's relative to them. You hope that is the common goal, and we're tackling it as individuals. And Darian, you said we're not creating community, and recognizing and respecting the power that comes with elevating each other. When you elevate each other, you elevate the industry, you also elevate the client experience. There's natural synchronicity and reciprocity in that paradigm, in that sort of relational context, but yet it's not happening. And the way that it needs to be, in a way for it to be effective and sustainable. And I feel like, having been in the industry as long as I have, like, there are pockets of that, but as a collective, where are we at? What are we doing? And I think, Chris, one of your points about people being vulnerable and desperate to get answers, I think access is another thing that's not working well. You look at the cost of, say, somebody seeking out maybe nutrition services. Sometimes it's $145 out of pocket. Yes, we do have some platforms that do work with insurance and accept it, but there are also insurances that are now shifting their telehealth policies and thus cutting off that access that was there. So it's almost like we're just like in our own way in some respects. There's an access issue when it comes to some of these services.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I remember way back 20 years ago when my services were not covered by insurance, were now covered by most insurances and Medicaid, that I'd be going to see families and I'd look at their houses and their basements were bigger than my entire house. Or you could see how many resources they had. And then I would go as an educator into areas where people didn't have as many resources. They had the same needs, but not the same resources. And it almost felt cruel to tell them that these things were available because they weren't accessible to them. And I remember that was my biggest why in fighting for coverage and fighting for people to be able to have access to these things, because I wanted things to be fair. I wanted things to be equitable. And I find that maybe our generation has not done a very good job of explaining that to the new generation. In some ways, those who do not learn from history are doomed to repeat it. I see some of our newer generation maybe not standing on the shoulders of giants in some ways. Like I always tell my students, I'll show you what I know. It's your job to go and do it better than I can. That's been my mantra. But I also think it's important to go back and go, why did those people do it that way? Why didn't they do it this way? Oh, because they didn't know XYZ, and now we know XYZ, and now I can go and add to that and build my own XYZ over here. I think that's what's missing, at least from my field, is the holistic perspective of how this field has evolved and how what was done over here that looks really crude sets the stage for the sophisticated thing that I'm doing right now.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It's always like discussing things that are like what we're doing, what we're not doing well. There's a lot of vulnerability in discussing, hey, what's not going well. A lot of times we just like to skip over to let's just have these solutions, but there's a lot of power in talking about, hey, an evaluation of what have we not done well. And so that leads to what are some practical solutions among this group that we have that can help people with misinformation that maybe it's practical, but also unique that you haven't seen done that you'd like to see done. Erin, I'll start you off with that.
I think that's such a great and loaded question, because looking at it from what's not working well, having data informed direction forward. And Chris, you were saying, looking back and wondering, like, why didn't they do it this way? Oh, it's because they didn't know, but they had information that told them they didn't know these things. I think not having ever had an actual set of data points that say we've tried X, Y, and Z and it hasn't happened. We're diving in and trying to very observational, right? That what we're discussing is these are the things that we're observing as professionals. And I think we really have to, one, I think the duty of us as professionals is to create safety in conversations with clients and patients, whoever your demographic is, whoever you're serving, and allow them that space to be vulnerable and talk about the things that like are coming up for them and things that they're reading about and things that they're hearing about. And I think sometimes I see with like newer certified personal trainers or health coaches, they're very mindful of the scope of practice, almost to a degree that it silences them. Not the scope itself, but their perception of what they can and cannot discuss and what they can and cannot be open with tends to mute them a little bit. And so I think one way to help that is for seasoned professionals like us to mentor other professionals that are coming up. This is how we can address some of this misinformation together, but then also in our individual little microcosms that we work within. But creating safety in that conversation, I can't count the number of times, like when I started really early on, nutrition scope of practice, very clear for certified health and exercise professionals. There's just no arguing with it. And I remember clients asking me questions about nutrition, and I would be so afraid, even though in my mind I knew what they were talking about wasn't correct. I would be afraid to address it because I didn't know how to address it in a way that was curious and educational versus don't listen to that kind of a thing. So I think the mentorship piece is really missing, and that needs to happen in order for us to rising tide lift all ships. I think like we have to have something like that. Like Chris, you were saying, it's my job to work with students and say, here's the thing, go out and do it better than me. Isn't that really the heart of mentoring? Here's what I learned. Here were the landmines. Go out and do it better. And I think that is one, maybe not a practical strategy, but a very obvious solution to getting people on the same page that are in profession. But again, going back to creating safety in that conversation, I think professionals need to hone specific skills that are conversational, like nonviolent communication. unconditional positive regard and caring regard and appreciative inquiry, and really having open conversations about, I'll give an example. A client comes to me and says, sugar's evil. And I've heard that I really just can't have that. And it's just derailing me all over. Instead of asking, why do you think that? I offer it sounds like this is a concern for you. And is this something you'd like to discuss openly in a coaching session? Almost always they're going to say yes. And so then I'm going to ask them, like, what is it that you've learned about this? And what of that information both intrigues you and concerns you? And we process it in a conversation. I honestly think a practical solution or strategy is talking, like less directing and more, again, approaching with curiosity. What is it that's interesting them about the cabbage soup diet? Or insert whatever crazy thing, but I think we need to talk more. We need to talk more to each other as professionals and more openly with our clients and receiving their concerns in a way that allows us to affirm them, reflect that this is what they're saying and this is what I hear you saying, and then offer, like, how do you feel if I were to share more information with you? And then go from there on whatever said topic is.
Yeah, Erin, you had me at mentoring. I think mentoring is the secret sauce, and I think it's what is missing. This building community of generation.
Yes.
Where we have a reciprocal information sharing going on, where somebody brings something to the table and says, I read this, can we go through this together? A place where I do a mentoring group every Sunday night, and there's 3 of us who are pretty seasoned professionals, and we have a couple of new early career people. And the one thing that we try to create a safe space for you to say anything at all. We're not going to shut you down if you say something quote unquote dumb. And I put that in air quote. The idea that it's a reciprocal relationship, talking about the mistakes I've made. And Lordy, I've made enough.
Ditto.
And being able to say it's okay to make mistakes, but part of being a scientist is learning from your mistakes, looking at the literature, seeking out mentorship, seeking out supervision, and being able to say, I don't know. I say that quite a bit, even in my coaching, where somebody will ask me something, I say, I honestly don't know. Where can we get that info? I think that's really important. And again, like you said, coming from an inquiry kind of thing, rather than you're wrong.
Or that person is wrong.
Right.
We don't need to downgrade each other.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. We had something in our field that got really heated to the point where there was an article retracted, where people were called out for what the authors believed was misinformation. And I think the full-on response to that was calling people out doesn't work. That's not the way we should be doing things. We combat misinformation with teaching people information. Mm-hmm. And like you said in your seminar, our voices get louder, will drown out the misinformation voices. Mm-hmm. And it won't be necessary for us to tell them that they're wrong.
Like, it will just be the obvious that.
Yeah, people start to attend to things that help them.
Yeah, most definitely. Those are great things. I'll add to it. I think to combat misinformation, it's certainly, I think, important to meet people from generations where they're currently at and how they communicate. So whatever that means for this generation, next generation, things, what are the devices, platforms, areas that people communicate, but then creating more credibility in those spaces. Maybe less of calling people out, but just getting yourself out there. And one of the things I think is really important for scientists is for scientists to speak up and be on podcasts and be on different things and be out there. That's what influencers do well, is getting their brand out there. So if you work in academic institutions or training people regularly to Group X, you should be on podcasts. You should be writing articles. You should be getting out there to put yourself out there. And with doing that, you already start creating a line of information or a branch on the tree that is more credible without denigrating other people
Right.
for that. I would say on another thing, in higher education, we need to prepare people to be better professionals out there. One thing I think should definitely happen is we should be having interdisciplinary tracks. I've thought about this a lot. Degrees that combine both the personal training certification, be able to sit for licensed therapists as well, and other professions within that, so that the person comes out and they can actually and do more than just train someone or teach a group X class. They can also bill for services for therapy services as well, because our people in our field, they struggle to stay in the field. This is a very difficult field to stay in. When you're working on commission and you need to have a paycheck regularly, you need to have various ways to stay in the business to make an impact on misinformation. Because you may want to make an impact in decreasing misinformation, but on the other side of that shoulder is telling you, am I actually going to be in this business long to do this? So I think there's some systemic things that need to change and happen to actually get a more well-rounded professional, better professionals in the business, and make it feel more essential and to rise the level of professionalism. And that also combats misinformation. And you can tell I've thought about this a lot. The other
Yeah.
thing, I think my last thing I'll say is the larger professional institutions, such as your certifying agencies, marketing agencies, they all need to come together. I actually think we need to have less conferences, not more conferences, more combined conferences where people don't have to make decisions financially on which thing they can go to or not to, so they can get fed good information for that. So more discussion amongst larger institutions about combining what they do. I know that IDEA is working on this. They did the one with ACSM, which I thought was great. We need to do more of that. Not everybody can go to 10 conferences a year. That's an access issue. It's a financial issue. That's also hurting our work against misinformation there. All right, that was a lot to say.
I think that is an amazing point. And I go through that same thing. Which conference do I go to? And it's almost like you just have to roll a dice, or obviously the givens are when you're presenting at one, clearly you're going to go to that one. But then there's the travel component. There's the time away from work. If you are somebody who has like multiple jobs, that is an access issue and it precludes you from getting the misinformation. To add to that, I think we need to have more virtual options in realms of these conferences. Offer another option. Maybe it's not at the same time. Maybe it is like a different package. Maybe it looks different, but we figured out during COVID, we can do this. Why can't it be like a sort of a la carte option or something like you can build your virtual package if you're unable to travel, because it is a finance issue. I think that's really important for people who are just starting in the industry, who are newly certified, who have this desire to network and go to conferences, but maybe it's not within their wallet at this point. What are the other options outside of reading an article, taking a quiz, and doing a home study course, and maybe a webinar? What else is out there? How can we shift that lens of accessibility for education-wise? And Darian, I think you're totally right on an interdisciplinary. I've thought a lot about like how teaching at different schools and different colleges, how do we get this group to talk to this group of students? And how do we create this interdisciplinary mentorship? Say there's like a health coaching program, but there's also a dietetics program. There are skills that health coaching can offer RDN, motivational interviewing, appreciative inquiry, coach, like just general coaching skills. Like, how do we get these students together? Because when you're going through college and you choose your major, like you're like a cohort, right? Like that, those are your people, but they're not just, those aren't your only people. So how do we create more collaborative communities within the educational space to allow for this cross-fertilization of ideas? And in dietetics, is what we do. It would allow learners of any profession to better understand the processes, the skill, the requirements of another profession that happens to be scoped or focused on this thing, whereas you're over here focused on this thing, but there's still an interdisciplinary partnership. And isn't that what we teach when we talk to students about building a referral network? You got to have one as a health and fitness professional. And as a psychologist, as a physical therapist, as a dietitian, we need each other. The simplest way to put it is I need you, you need me, we need each other. So how do we model that, mentor that in the educational spaces that then like translate into that profession, and we just carry that momentum forward so it is a collaborative community.
Yeah, Darren, you had me at interdisciplinary.
Yes.
Because I recently went back to school and got the health coach and personal trainer certificate because I wanted to make sure that I had both complementary skill sets. And I am seeing health and wellness coaching and behavior analysis, like they're reinventing the wheel with each other. So I'm seeing some things over in health and wellness coaching, and I'm thinking to myself, well, we've known about that for about 50 years, and we've got some stuff we can tell you. And then I see things in behavior analysis, and I'm like, the health and wellness coaching people have that kind of figured out. And I think they might have something to tell you over here. I did that with, speaking of mentoring, I'm mentored by a person who was one of B.F. Skinner's students. And he's very much into what's called verbal shaping, which is reinforcing the way that we talk. And I said, oh, that kind of sounds like we could bring motivational interviewing into that and then have a much more robust idea of how that works. And he says, I never heard of this motivational interviewing. Send me some stuff. So when we start to cross-pollinate, I think we share knowledge and we stop reinventing the wheel so many times that we can say, hey, I know what you want to do over here. I've got the knowledge over here. You come back and show me what you know too. And yeah, one of the things that we had at our conference recently was there's a lot of talk about micro-credentialing.
Yes.
The idea that specialties within a credential. And I could see where this interdisciplinary thing would lend itself really well to micro-credentialing.
That is such a good point. And I know there are other organizations that are talking, like educational institutions that are talking about micro-credentialing. And to some degree, I think we've seen that for a little while. At least I can only speak from mine and Darian's side of it. But like specialty certs, there's like a micro thing. And I think that would be really interesting. And I think what would also be really interesting when we talk about cross-pollination and interdisciplinary is like at these large conferences, when you apply to be a speaker, most generally you have to be someone in that field that knows X, Y, and Z. Like how beautiful would it be if there were just a couple of spots for speakers outside of, I'll just use exercise science as an example, or exercise physiology and health and exercise nutrition, whatever. How beautiful would it be if we had somebody outside that space as adjunct to it to come in and talk about a specific skill set within their field or a specific body of knowledge or a body of literature that has relevancy to the work that you do. It doesn't change your scope. It widens your thinking. And I think that would be a really beautiful thing to see more often than we do now. And it's, I don't know, not to be too philosophical about it, but like Plato's parable of the cave. It's like we're all like in this dark space and unaware, and then you emerge into the light. And really that's what we need. We come out of the cave and enlighten each other and cross-pollinate because we're not a threat to each other. Basically, the one question we can ask is like, how do we do what we do better together for the outcomes of those we serve, to improve those outcomes, whether it's cardiometabolic risk factors, whether it's mental health, whether it's like the self-harm you talked about, Chris. Like, how do we do what we do, but better together, if that makes sense?
I am a huge fan of Plato's Cave, so you can talk about that as much as you want.
Love that. Oh, I love that.
I mean, the favorite courses in college were all philosophy courses for me because it resonated with my existence and life and how boundaries I have with people and how to argue properly and effectively with people. But I think that's, and as we're wrapping up here, I think that's the large, that we are in a cave. And I think a lot of our solutions are Band-Aid solutions. They don't address the real symptomology, which is that we are in a cave. And if we don't solve this problem of getting together better and believing in each other and creating a real verifiable community that is based off mentorship, essentialism on different levels, then the other stuff is just Band-Aid stuff. Or so we have, and as I always tell my clients and other colleagues, the greatest work we can do is the work we do within first. How do we do that work on ourselves first? It's like a Tolstoy quote. Everyone's interested, and this is very apropos to the fitness, health, and wellness industry. You come out of it, everyone's interested in changing the world, but very few people are very interested in changing themselves. And we have to change ourselves first and how we move in the industry. Then we'll start by just osmosis. Things will get better. We'll raise up the level. The tide will swell. People will see. And you really won't have to stay that much because they'll see the goodness and the togetherness and the connective tissue that we all have together.
Yeah, I think that is a really beautiful way to state it. Absolutely. And I think that there's real power in looking inward first, because that's the hard work, right? It's so much easier to focus externally and be like, God, don't open that door, when you're talking about these inside vulnerabilities and these insecurities and these things that, as people walking a human journey, those are inherent to us. And I think being able to do just what you said, Darian, create this beautiful symbiosis across all of these disciplines that is sorely lacking. And not necessarily because it's intentional, but because we've all kind of been segregated. You want to do X, you go and learn this. You want to do Y, you go and learn this. And then there's not a lot of that crossover, and the mosaic doesn't really exist.
Yeah. And we have to stop being in this industry and being in it based off of fear.
Yeah.
We fear what other people do. We fear their success, and we see it and we feel threatened by it. And this is the stuff we need to confront, this reality among ourselves.
Yeah.
And then what would it look like if someone like Christine, someone who's doing behavior analysis and N-of-1 research, is in a video with someone who's a big influencer together? And there's no ego there. It's just, we're here to help other people for that. But we have to work on ourselves and get rid of this fear mindset that this person, they're so successful. Like, why not me? Why don't I have this success? We need to really challenge ourselves to be uncomfortable with those thoughts.
Yeah. And I think being willing to speak greatness into existence. Like, I always tell my clients when I work with them on wellness visions, it's like, what you seek is seeking you. So speak it. Speak beautifully about it. And there's real power in words, and thoughts have power. And the same thing is true when you're thinking those things of like, why not me? Instead, ask the question of like, how did they?
Yeah.
What can I learn from them? We all have different flares that I think we can lend to each other, and you're better together. We don't achieve success alone. And we shouldn't celebrate it alone either.
Certainly. We'll wrap up here. Christine, I would love to hear any final thoughts you have about this topic, and also just any way people could reach you to learn more about your work.
Sure, absolutely. I think it comes back to we have to do good work, and we have to elevate others, like you said, Erin, and we have to be willing to mentor, and we also have to be willing to be humble and bring that good science to the forefront, and that's the way we grow. I hold a couple of different hats. I am a professor at George Mason University in special ed behavior analysis. If people want to learn more about our program, they can email me at, should I give the email address or?
Yeah, that's up to you, whatever your comfort level is.
Sure, it's choffner, Hofner, at gmu.edu. I also hold a private practice, coaching and behavior analysis, behavior change things, mentoring, early career behavior analysts, and people can email me at the same email address and I will get them information on that as well.
Awesome. Erin, any final thoughts? And also, same thing, let everyone know.
Yeah. So just a couple of things thinking about some practical strategies that we as individuals, because there's the practical side of collective, right? But there's also the practical piece of the individual work, what we need to do. And I think the biggest thing is be unselfish with your knowledge and ask when you don't understand. I think it's so important to be like, I quite get it. And that doesn't mean you're not intelligent, you're not practiced, you're not wise. It just means, hey, explain it to me. So I think being unselfish with your knowledge is so critical. And I think that's a cornerstone of mentorship and quality mentorship. It's being willing to be in that space and be like, you know what? I used to tell clients this and it was so off the mark. And here's why it's off the mark. So I think those are two things. And then as far as if you want to get in touch with me, my email is erinmd03@gmail.com. I'm on LinkedIn. You could find me on Instagram at Nitschke Erin. I'm always happy to jump on a Zoom call and have a conversation or just help where I can. So please feel free to connect and reach out.
Fantastic. Thank you both for being on here and providing some really solid information and just being awesome people. Thank you so much.
Thank you.